The fouled anchor was less a building and more a collection of grievances, held together by salt-caked timber and the stubborn refusal of its patrons to drink anywhere else. It squatted on the edge of Naval Station Norfolk, breathing in the diesel fumes from the destroyers and exhaling the scent of stale beer and fried fish. The air inside was a thick marinade of regret and maritime damp, clinging to the dark wood of the bar and the cracked vinyl of the booths. The low-wattage bulbs, caged in wire mesh like dangerous animals, cast a jaundiced glow that made everyone look weary and slightly ill. It was a place where stories were told, mostly lies, and where the hierarchy of the outside world was supposed to dissolve in a wash of cheap whiskey. Supposed to. In a corner booth, away from the boisterous knot of petty officers near the dartboard, a woman sat alone. She was a study in deliberate anonymity. Her hair, a nondescript brown with threads of steel gray at the temples, was pulled back in a severe, functional knot. She wore simple gray slacks and a dark blue blouse that could have been purchased from any department store in the country. There was no jewelry, no makeup, nothing to draw the eye. She might have been a mid-level civil servant, a logistics contractor waiting for a flight, or a local librarian who had taken a very wrong turn. She was bent over a thick, binder-clipped document, its pages dense with complex schematics and differential equations. Her focus was absolute, a small island of intense concentration in the rolling ocean of bar noise. She did not seem to hear the clang of a dropped beer mug or the sudden roar of laughter from the bar. She simply read, her finger tracing a line of calculations, her expression as placid and unreadable as a deep sea trench. This quietude was an offense to Chief Gunner's mate Damien Thorne. The fouled anchor was his court, and he was its loud, swaggering king. Thorne was a man carved from naval tradition, or at least his own cartoonish interpretation of it. He was broad in the shoulder and thick in the neck, with a jaw that seemed permanently set in a state of belligerent defiance. His face was a roadmap of sun and scowls, and his voice was a gravelly boom that he used to hammer conversations into submission. For 15 years, he had been the loudest man in any room he entered, a fact he equated with being the most important. Authority to Chief Thorne was not something you earned through quiet competence. It was something you projected, a signal you broadcast at maximum volume to drown out all competing frequencies. And the woman in his booth was broadcasting nothing. This was Thorne's booth. Everyone knew it. It was the one with the best view of the door and the bar, the one farthest from the leaking corner of the men's room. He had claimed it through years of sheer, unadulterated presence. To see it occupied by this drab speck of a person was a personal affront. It was a disruption in the natural order of his universe. He watched her for a full 2 minutes, his irritation simmering like bilge water in the summer sun. She didn't belong. She was a clerical error in the ledger of his establishment. He downed the last of his beer, slammed the empty glass on the bar with a thud that made the bartender flinch, and began his slow, deliberate march across the room. The other sailors quieted slightly, sensing the shift in the bar's atmosphere. They knew their chief. This was sport for him. They turned, some with grins, some with a weary sense of inevitability, to watch the jackal dance at the edge of what he perceived to be his territory. Thorne didn't walk so much as he partitioned the air in front of him, his heavy frame a blunt instrument of intent. He stopped before the booth, casting a large shadow that fell across the woman's technical manual. She did not look up. Her finger continued its slow, methodical journey across a page filled with stress, tensors, and fluid dynamics. The light from the caged bulb glinted off the silver in her hair. "You're in my seat," Thorn boomed. It was not a question. It was a verdict. For a moment, there was no response. The woman finished the line she was tracing, her focus so complete that it seemed to bend the world around her, leaving him outside its event horizon. Only then did she lift her head. Her eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky over the North Atlantic. They held no fear, no surprise, no anger. They held nothing but a calm, analytical curiosity, as if she were examining a peculiar specimen of marine fungus. "This seat was unoccupied when I arrived," she stated. Her voice was low and even, devoid of inflection. It was a simple presentation of fact, offered with the same dispassionate clarity as the numbers on her page. Thorn's face tightened. He was accustomed to a certain rhythm in these encounters. His booming assertion, followed by a flustered apology, nervous scramble to vacate, or at the very least, a show of deference. This flat, factual statement was like a gear grinding in the well-oiled machinery of his dominance. It denied him the friction he needed to generate his customary heat. "Doesn't matter," he growled, leaning forward and placing his thick, calloused hands on the table. The wood groaned under his weight. "It's my seat. Everyone here knows it. So move." The woman's gaze flickered from his eyes to his hands on the table, then back. A flicker of something, not annoyance, but perhaps classification, passed through her expression. She was cataloging him. She was assessing his structural integrity, his failure points. "I am not finished with my work," she said, her tone unchanged. "There are several other empty booths. Perhaps you could use one of them." A low chuckle rippled through the assembled sailors. This was unexpected. The quiet librarian had a spine, but it was the spine of a mouse challenging a python, and they all knew how that story ended. Thorn's face, already ruddy from beer and sun, deepened to a shade of raw brick. He was being dismissed. He, Chief Gunner's mate Thorn, was being treated like an inconvenience by this gray, anonymous woman. "Your work?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. He gestured vaguely at the binder. "What's that? Planning the next bake sale for the Officers' Wives Club? Listen, lady, I don't know who you are, but this is a Navy bar. We have a way of doing things. And right now, the way of things is you getting out of my booth." The woman did not reply. Instead, she took a thin silver pen from her blouse pocket, made a tiny, precise notation in the margin of her document, and then carefully closed the heavy binder. She placed the pen neatly beside it. The actions were small, deliberate, and maddeningly calm. It was the calm of a lioness allowing a jackal to bark and snarl, knowing that the distance between them was entirely at her discretion. This unnerving lack of reaction was more infuriating to Thorn than any shouted insult could have been. He needed her to be scared. He needed her to be angry. He needed her to participate in the ritual of his dominance, and she was refusing to play her part. His frustration, having no emotional purchase on her, turned inward and curdled into pure rage. He was losing control of the room. The smirks on his men's faces were no longer just for her. They were for him. His authority was being questioned by a ghost. "I said move!" he roared, and this time his action was as loud as his voice. He grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table and shoved it hard. The table leg screeched against the floor, ramming into the woman's legs. The binder and her pen slid and clattered to the floor. She did not cry out. She did not flinch. She simply moved with the impact, her body absorbing the force with an unexpected resilience. But Thorn was not finished. He reached across the table, his hand closing around her upper arm. His intent was to haul her bodily from the booth, to display his physical superiority in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. It was a profound miscalculation. The moment his fingers tightened on her arm, he felt it. It was not the soft, yielding flesh he expected. Beneath the thin fabric of her blouse was a sinewy hardness, a density of muscle and tendon that felt like braided steel cable. It was the arm of someone whose body was not an afterthought, but a highly conditioned instrument. But his momentum was already committed. He yanked. And in that same instant, the world outside the fouled anchor ended. There was no warning. One moment, the air was filled with the familiar sounds of the harbor. The next, a profound, gut-wrenching silence fell, as if the world had taken a sharp intake of breath. This was followed by a sound that did not come through the ears but through the soles of their feet, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated up through the pilings of the building. The lights in the bar flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a disorienting, murky darkness, lit only by the weak, emergency-powered exit signs. Then came the wind. It was not a gale or a gust. It was a solid wall of moving air that struck the building with the force of a freight train. The old timber groaned in protest. The windows on the seaward side of the bar didn't just shatter. They exploded inward, spraying the room with a lethal confetti of glass shards. A roar filled the space, a sound of such primal, overwhelming fury that it seemed to negate all other existence. It was the sound of the ocean and the sky merging into a single, malevolent entity. Panic erupted. Men who had faced down threats on every ocean on Earth were reduced to shouting, stumbling figures in the dark. Chairs were overturned. Someone screamed as a piece of flying debris struck them. The roar of the wind was punctuated by the sharp, terrifying crack of splintering wood and the shriek of twisting metal from the docks outside. Chief Thorne, his hand still on the woman's arm, was thrown off balance. His carefully constructed world of dominance and barroom hierarchy had been obliterated in less than 5 seconds. He let go of her, stumbling back, his mind struggling to process the sheer violence of the onslaught. The established order collapsed into chaos. The bar owner, a retired master chief, was shouting something about a generator, but his words were swallowed by the gale. A young petty officer was frozen by the blown-out window, staring in horror at the maelstrom outside. Thorne, for his part, did what he was trained to do. He started barking orders. "Secure that door! Someone get a flashlight! Find the first aid kit!" But his voice, usually a tool of absolute command, was now a thin, reedy thing against the storm's symphony of destruction. His orders were based on a textbook understanding of damage control, but this was not a textbook situation. This was chaos incarnate. His men, disoriented and scared, milled about with no real purpose, their actions clumsy and ineffective. They were sailors without a ship, without a captain, adrift in a sea of sudden, terrifying violence. And then, through the cacophony, a new sound emerged. It was a voice. Not loud, not shouting, but clear and sharp and resonant, cutting through the roar of the wind with the impossible precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "You, with the flashlight. Illuminate the main support beam on the west wall. Now." The voice belonged to the woman. In the terrifying dark, she had risen from the booth. She was no longer a drab, anonymous figure. She was a silhouette of absolute purpose against the sickly green glow of the emergency signs. Her previous stillness had been a form of potential energy, coiled and waiting. Now, It had been converted into kinetic action, and the effect was breathtaking. The young sailor with the flashlight, a kid named Davison, fumbled with the switch, his hands shaking. He clicked it on, its beam cutting a shaky path through the dust-filled air. He instinctively obeyed the command, swinging the light to the west wall. "Report," the woman's voice commanded. It's cracked, ma'am," Davison stammered. "There's a big crack near the top." "Negative," the voice snapped back, the word delivered with chilling certainty. "That is a tension fracture. The wind is creating a negative pressure differential on the leeward side of the structure. The roof is lifting. In approximately 90 seconds, that beam will fail, and the roof will collapse. We have to vent the structure now." The clinical, technical language fell into the panicked room like an alien artifact. Negative pressure differential, tension fracture. It was the language of an engineer, a physicist. Who was this woman? She didn't wait for an answer. She moved. Her movements were not rushed. They were economical, fluid, and utterly confident. She swept past the stunned Chief Thorne as if he were a piece of furniture. "You," she said, pointing to a burly boatswain's mate. "And you." She pointed to another. "That bar is solid oak. Use it as a ram. We're taking out the main door on the landward side. Not the frame, the door itself. Go." The two men, accustomed to obeying commands backed by the weight of rank, hesitated for a fraction of a second. They looked at Thorne, their nominal leader. Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, a statue of obsolete authority. The woman didn't raise her voice. She simply fixed the two sailors with her pale, gray eyes, and in that gaze was a gravity 1,000 times more compelling than Thorne's parade ground bellow. Authority radiated from her, not like a broadcast signal, but like the heat from a furnace. It was a fundamental property of her being. They moved. They heaved the heavy, beer-soaked bar from its mountings with a groan of tortured metal. "Chief," the woman said, turning to Thorne. Her tone was not contemptuous. It was the voice of a superior officer addressing a subordinate who was failing to perform his duties. "Get your men. Anyone not injured. We're creating a relay line. The pier outside is collapsing. That vessel—" She pointed a finger into the screaming darkness toward a small, specialized patrol craft that was bucking wildly at its moorings. "Is the Sea Serpent. It's a prototype hydrofoil. Its mooring lines are rated for a Category 2 hurricane, not a microburst with this level of tornadic shear. The stern line is already gone. If the bowline snaps, she'll be driven into the primary fuel depot. The resulting explosion will compromise half the naval station." Thorne stared at her, his mind a maelstrom of confusion. How did she know the vessel's name? How did she know the tensile strength of its mooring lines? How did she know the precise location of the fuel depot? "Chief, do you understand the order?" Her voice was sharp, impatient. The time for quiet observation was over. The word order was the key. It was the stimulus that finally broke through his paralysis. He was a chief petty officer of the United States Navy. He followed orders, and though he had no idea who this woman was, he recognized, on a primal, instinctual level that transcended rank or uniform, that he was in the presence of command. "Aye," he choked out, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Aye, ma'am." He turned to the stunned group of sailors. "You heard her. Let's go. Move, move, move." As the two boatswain's mates used the bar to batter down the main door, a gust of wind tore through the newly opened hole. equalizing the pressure and easing the terrifying strain on the roof. The groaning of the support beam lessened. The woman was already moving toward the blown-out window, peering into the horizontal rain and shrieking wind. She seemed to be calculating, her head tilted as if listening to a complex piece of music. She was reading the storm. "The eye wall is passing over," she announced to no one in particular. "We have a window, maybe 3 minutes. Chief, I need every available man on that pier. We're not trying to save the vessel. We're going to try and sever the bowline and let her go aground on the mudflats. It's the only way to keep her clear of the depot." What she was suggesting was insane. It was an act of controlled destruction, a sacrifice of a valuable prototype to prevent a greater catastrophe. It was also, Thorne realized with a sickening lurch in his gut, absolutely brilliant. It was a cold, hard, strategic calculation, the kind that won wars and saved lives, made in seconds, under impossible pressure. For the next 3 minutes, the woman orchestrated a symphony of desperate, focused action. She directed Thorne's men with a language they understood, not just orders, but the physics behind the orders. "I need 4 of you to act as a counterweight. Use that winch cable. Watch the tidal surge. It's running counter to the wind direction. That's creating a torsional stress on the cleat. We have to sever it on the downswell." She stood on the splintered edge of the pier, the wind tearing at her, her simple blouse plastered to her frame, her gray-streaked hair whipping around her face. She was utterly transformed. The anonymous librarian was gone, replaced by a Valkyrie in the heart of the storm. She pointed, she commanded, she calculated, and the men, including Thorne, obeyed without question. They worked with a desperate efficiency they hadn't felt since their days in basic training. They formed a human chain, passing tools, shouting warnings, their movements guided by her calm, precise instructions that cut through the gale. Thorne found himself heaving on a rope next to Davison, the rain and sea spray lashing his face, his muscles screaming in protest. And all the while, he kept stealing glances at the woman, his mind reeling. Who was she? Just as the last strand of the thick bowline was severed with a mighty crack, sending the sea serpent skittering away into the churning darkness toward the relative safety of the mudflats. A new light cut through the storm. It was the powerful, sweeping searchlights of a heavy-duty emergency vehicle, followed by the flashing blue and red of several others. A convoy was arriving from the main base. The vehicles slid to a halt, and figures in full storm gear began to emerge. The lead figure was tall and imposing, even in the bulky gear. He pulled off his hood, revealing the stern, weathered face and the silver eagle on the collar of Rear Admiral Carrick, the commander of the entire naval station. Carrick's face was a mask of grim concern as he surveyed the devastation. His eyes swept over the wrecked pier, the damaged bar, the exhausted, drenched sailors, and then his eyes found the woman. The change in the Admiral's demeanor was instantaneous and profound. The grim mask of the commander vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, which was immediately followed by something that looked like immense relief. He stopped dead in his tracks. The men with him, a mix of base security and a Navy SEAL fire team, halted as well, sensing the dramatic shift in their leader. In the howling wind, Admiral Carrick did something that made Chief Thorne's blood run cold. He straightened his back, his posture shifting from that of a commander in the field to that of a subordinate. He brought his heels together with an audible click, and his right hand snapped up in the sharpest, most formal salute Thorne had ever seen. "Keystone!" Carrick's voice boomed, amplified by the strange acoustics of the storm. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of deference. "Good God, ma'am, what are you doing here? We had you listed on the transport manifest for ZO 600. The woman turned to face him. The rain had plastered her hair to her scalp, and a cut on her cheek was bleeding freely, but her pale gray eyes were as calm and analytical as ever. She gave the Admiral a curt, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that was somehow more commanding than a return salute. "My transport was delayed, Admiral," she said, her voice carrying easily over the wind. "We encountered an unforeseen variable in the local weather pattern." Carrick slowly lowered his salute, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He looked at the severed mooring line, the grounded patrol boat, and the exhausted but safe sailors. He looked at the vented, still-standing structure of the fouled anchor. His experienced eyes took in the entire scene and understood in a heartbeat what had transpired. He saw not chaos, but the result of a masterful, controlled response to chaos. "Unforeseen variable," he repeated, a slow smile of pure professional admiration spreading across his face. He shook his head. "Of course. You didn't just survive it. You stress-tested it." The collection of sailors, Thorne included, stood like statues, water dripping from their faces, their minds failing to bridge the chasm that had just opened in their reality. Keystone? Ma'am? The Admiral? Saluting her? The cognitive dissonance was a physical blow. Carrick's gaze fell upon Chief Thorne, who was still standing near the woman, looking utterly poleaxed. The Admiral's expression hardened. He knew Thorne. He knew his reputation. He took in Thorne's soaked clothing, his proximity to the woman, and the lingering tension in the air, and he made an educated and entirely correct guess. "Chief," Carrick said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. "Report." Thorne opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? "I was just assaulting a 2-star general, sir, because she was in my favorite seat." The absurdity and the sheer, terrifying gravity of his actions crashed down on him all at once. His entire career, his identity, everything he had built, had just been pulverized by the storm and his own colossal arrogance. The woman saved him. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting Carrick's. "Chief Thorne and his men acted with commendable efficiency under extreme duress, Admiral," she stated, her voice flat and factual. "Their rapid response prevented a Class 1 disaster at the fueling depot. I'll be recommending them all for a unit citation." The statement was so unexpected, so contrary to the justice Thorne knew he deserved, that it was more disorienting than the storm itself. It was a lifeline, thrown to him when he was already halfway to the bottom. He stared at her, his mind a blank slate of shock. Admiral Carrick looked at the woman, then back at the pale, trembling chief, and a flicker of understanding passed through his eyes. He recognized the move. It wasn't mercy. It was something far more complex. It was a tactical decision. She wasn't saving Thorne from punishment. She was claiming him. "I see," Carrick said slowly, nodding to her. "As you'd expect, ma'am. I'll see to it." He then turned his full attention to the assembled sailors. His voice became the formal boom of command once more. "Listen up. For those of you who have not had the privilege, this is Major General Evelyn Reed. Her current assignment is above your pay grade. She is, for all intents and purposes, the foremost structural and strategic vulnerability expert in the entire Department of Defense. When a dam in enemy territory needs to fail, when a bunker needs to be impenetrable, when a carrier group's hull integrity is questioned, they call her. She is here on a full authority directive from the Joint Chiefs. Her word here is the word of God. Is that clear?" A ragged chorus of "Yes, sir," came from the stunned men. Major General Evelyn Reed. The name descended on the room like a bomb. Not just a general. The general. The legend whispered about in engineering circles and Black Ops briefing rooms. The woman they called Keystone, because she was the central, load-bearing element in so many critical operations. The ghost who moved through the military's highest echelons, leaving a trail of solved problems and humbled engineers in her wake. And Damien Thorne had shoved her. He had put his hands on her. He felt a wave of nausea so profound he had to brace himself against a piling. The storm began to abate, its fury spent. The roar subsided to a resentful moan. In the relative quiet, General Reed walked calmly over to where her binder lay in a puddle on the floor. She picked it up, the pages soaked and ruined. She looked at it for a moment, her expression unreadable, then tucked it under her arm. She walked back toward Thorne, her boots making quiet, squelching sounds on the soaked floorboards. She stopped directly in front of him. He forced himself to meet her gaze. The pale gray eyes were no longer just analytical. There was something else in them now, something ancient and heavy. "Chief Thorne," she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "Your initial reaction to an unknown element in your environment was to assert dominance through physical intimidation. Your situational awareness was zero. You misjudged the asset. You misjudged the environment. You failed to gather intelligence. You escalated a neutral situation into a hostile one based on a flawed, emotional bias. Each sentence was a perfectly placed, perfectly weighted stone, building a wall of his failure around him. This was not an angry tirade. It was a clinical after-action report, and it was the most devastating dressing down he had ever received. As a tactical failure, she continued, it was catastrophic. You were lucky. Your opponent was not hostile, and the environment provided an immediate, overriding priority. Had circumstances been different, your career would now be over. You might well be dead." Thorne could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. "However," she went on, her tone shifting slightly, "your performance under my direction during the crisis was adequate. You are strong, you follow orders, and you have the capacity to function under pressure, provided that pressure is correctly applied and directed by a competent authority. There is potential. Raw, undisciplined, and dangerously arrogant potential. But it is there." She paused, letting the words sink in. Admiral Carrick stood a respectful distance away, watching the exchange with the intense focus of a man witnessing history. "I am requisitioning you, Chief," General Reed said, the words landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Effective 0600 tomorrow, you will report to my temporary command post. You will be my personal aide for the duration of my assignment here. You will carry my gear. You will drive my vehicle. And you will learn the difference between the appearance of strength and its reality. You will learn to see the world not as a stage for your ego, but as a complex system of threats and opportunities. You will learn to observe, to analyze, and to act with precision, not prejudice. This is not a punishment. It is your education, and it will be extensive." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward Admiral Carrick, leaving Thorne standing alone in the wreckage of the bar and his own worldview. He watched her go, a small, unassuming woman in a ruined blouse, who had single-handedly tamed a storm and dismantled his entire existence without ever raising her voice. The story of that night passed into the mythology of the naval station. It became a modern fable, told in hushed tones in dive bars and training barracks, a cautionary tale for every arrogant young sailor who thought strength was measured in decibels. They called it Thorne's Education, or The Night the Keystone Landed. The details grew with each telling. The storm became a Category 5 hurricane. The patrol boat became a nuclear submarine, and Thorne's shove became a full-blown assault. But the core of the story, the essential truth of it, remained unchanged. Damien Thorne vanished from the social circles of the enlisted ranks. He was seen, but not heard. He was a shadow at the back of briefings, carrying General Reed's impossibly heavy cases. He was the silent driver of her nondescript government sedan. He stood at parade rest outside rooms where admirals and senators spoke to her in hushed, deferential tones. For 2 years, he was immersed in her world. He saw her deconstruct the blueprints of a new class of destroyer, finding a fatal flaw in its keel structure that 100 naval architects had missed. He watched her calmly talk a panicked 4-star general down from a catastrophic strategic blunder over a secure video link. He saw her stand in the heart of a hurricane simulator, a placid expression on her face as winds tore at her, because she said she needed to feel the data. He learned that her quietness was not a lack of presence, but a presence of a different kind. It was the quiet of a deep ocean, immense and powerful, that did not need to roar to prove its depth. He learned that her authority came not from a collar device or a booming voice, but from a competence so absolute and so profound that it was a force of nature in itself. She never spoke of the incident at the fouled anchor again. She never had to. His education was in observation. He was being forced to witness the reality he had been blind to, and the exposure was slowly, painfully, reshaping him. Years later, Master Chief Petty Officer Damien Thorne stood before a class of newly minted chiefs, the next generation of the Navy's backbone. He was a different man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady confidence that filled the room far more effectively than his old bluster ever had. His face was still a map, but the lines now spoke of wisdom and experience, not just sun and scowls. "There's one final thing you need to learn," he said to the young, proud faces looking up at him. "It's the most important lesson you will ever learn as a leader. It's about strength." He paused, letting his gaze travel over each of them. "You think strength is this," he said, making a fist. "You think it's the loudest voice in the room. You think it's the ability to intimidate, to dominate. You are wrong." He walked over to the window and looked out at the fleet, the gray ships sitting impassive and powerful in the harbor. "True strength," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is quiet. It is the unassuming woman in the corner of the bar reading a technical manual. It is the junior officer who asks the one question no one thought to ask. It is the calm, steady hand in the middle of a storm. It is competence, absolute, undeniable, and utterly indifferent to applause." He turned back to the class. "Your biggest threat as a leader will not be the enemy. It will be your own ego. It will be the assumptions you make based on what you see. You will judge people by their gender, their size, their rank, their uniform, and in doing so, you will make a catastrophic tactical error. You will mistake a quiet professional for a soft target. You will mistake a hidden master for a harmless civilian." A young chief in the front row, bold and full of the same unearned confidence Thorne once had, raised his hand. "With all due respect, Master Chief," he said, "that sounds like a nice theory. Do you have a practical example?" A slow, sad smile touched Damien Thorne's lips. "I do," he said. "Let me tell you a story about a storm, a bar called the Fouled Anchor, and a major general named Reed." And as he began to speak, he was not just teaching a class, he was giving testimony. He was passing on the most important lesson of his life, a lesson learned in humility and awe. The moral of the story was simple, and it was the foundation upon which all true leadership is built. Do not judge, observe, listen. For the most powerful forces in the world are rarely the loudest. They are the quiet, patient, and competent, who let their actions serve as their argument, and whose true nature is only revealed when the storm comes and all the lesser structures have been blown away. The world is full of hidden masters, and the wise sailor learns to recognize the stillness of the deep water, for it is always more powerful than the crashing of the superficial wave.